It can be so frustrating when you are dealing with somebody who really isn't taking accountability, who plays the victim, who doesn't show you any empathy. Your feelings, they matter. And there is a way to, learn to regulate your own system and then to create boundaries to where this person doesn't have the power or isn't in a position anymore to really, really cause a lot of suffering in your life. Hi, friends. Welcome back. Today we are talking about something that is so frustrating for a lot of us, and that is, how do you deal with the narcissists in your life? And really, this is such a popular subject right now online because I recently read a study. This is a psychiatric study, and it found that the biggest consequence of narcissism is the suffering of people close to them. And so if you think about that, if you are one of these people that are kind of in the orbit of someone who has narcissistic personality disorder, you are suffering. And when we suffer, especially in a dynamic with somebody with a personality disorder, it's such a frustrating position to be in because you are never validated. Your suffering will never be validated by this person. And so I think that's why we go online and we search things up and we want to hear about it. We want to be validated, right? And so hopefully this episode, if you are dealing with someone in your life who, shows these characteristics of narcissistic personality disorder, hopefully you will be validated. And then you'll also have some ways to really cope and deal with it and ultimately decide how much exposure you're going to have to this person, right? And every situation is different. So, what is narcissistic personality disorder? And first off, I don't typically talk in terms of specific diagnoses, and I don't think that way. It's very pathologizing. And while, the DSM is a really important tool for mental health professionals to really, understand and speak the same language of different disorders and how they show up with different symptoms, it's not how I think, because I like to conceptualize everyone as a system and how the system can get off and how there's so many ways for us to regain equilibrium and integration of our system. But the fact is that when people do have the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, it is typically a lifelong disorder. And so that is why I think it's a big deal when we call somebody a narcissist or when we use this language. It's a big deal, right? That's a big, heavy label. And so I like to stay away from it. I think in previous episodes, I've used the term toxic behavior because we are going to go through the actual definition of narcissistic personality disorder. What does that mean? What's the criteria that somebody has to meet to really officially get a diagnosis like this? So I've spoken more in terms of behaviors, and that term toxic behavior, I think, covers a lot of what we're going to see in the narcissistic personality disorder. But yeah, just a grain of salt here. It's not a term we should throw around lightly. And I certainly do not and don't like to use it, but it is something that we encounter. We encounter it in people in our lives, and I kind of feel that on a personal note, I've dealt with maybe more than my share of people who meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. That's just kind of been my experience in life. But I think when we have to deal with anyone who has these traits, these personality traits, it feels like too much. Even just one person in your life who behaves this way is going to feel like too much. But yeah, for me personally, I feel like I've had more than my share. And maybe that's why I'm talking about it, right? Helps us to get that validation and to process through it. Okay, so the DSM defines narcissistic personality disorder as a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, a lack of empathy with interpersonal entitlement, exploitiveness, arrogance, and envy. So that's kind of the overarching definition of narcissistic personality disorder. Now, there are 9 criteria, and someone must have 5 of the 9. So a little more than half of the criteria to really meet a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, so we're going to read through, and if you have someone in your mind, you're just thinking, do they have 5 out of these 9? Okay, so the first one is a grandiose sense of self-importance. So it's someone who exaggerates their achievements and their talents, and they really expect to be recognized as superior, even though maybe the facts don't really back that up. Okay, so that's criteria number 1. Okay, the second criteria is that this person has fantasies of unlimited success or power or brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. The third criteria is that they have a belief in being special and unique and can only be understood by or should be associated with other special or high-status people. The fourth criteria is that they require excessive admiration. The fifth is a sense of entitlement. So an unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations. The sixth criteria is that they are interpersonally exploitive, which really means they take advantage of other people and they use others for their own gain. I think this is one of the ones that triggers me. The seventh one is that they lack empathy. They're unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. And here is where we don't get that validation. The eighth criteria is a tendency to be envious of other or to believe that others are envious of them. And then the final one is arrogance, haughty behaviors or attitudes. So you can see there's kind of a mix of different things, but they really only need to have 5 out of the 9 to, technically meet the criteria for a diagnosis. And guess what? The fact is, if somebody has 2 of these criteria, they can still be a really difficult person to have in your life, right? Like somebody who is interpersonally exploitive and takes advantage of others and also lacks empathy and is unwilling to recognize or identify the feelings and needs of others, just those 2 things together can make someone be very difficult and really make us feel like invalidated and upset a lot. And so this is, again, why I would say toxic behaviors, but narcissists really have a stack of at least 5 of these toxic behaviors that are showing up as a pattern, right? This is how they live and interact and see the world. And that's why it can be so frustrating and maddening. So it's worth noting that these criteria, they're all criteria on how they display themselves to the outside world, right? These are all things that we can experience and notice and pick up on. But it is worth noting that someone who really does have this disorder, there's an internal experience that we don't really think about as much. It's hard to find a lot of empathy in ourselves for someone who's, not showing us empathy. But the fact is that, if someone is displaying these criteria, they have a real internal vulnerability and insecurity kind of at the core. I almost think of it like a black hole at the core of them. And all of these behaviors and all these criteria are like this big wall that, this big defense that they're kind of trying to build around this black hole at their core, where at their core, they just really have insecurities. They probably have very severe self-criticism. There's shame, there's fear, there's loneliness. Like, it is not pleasant at the core of someone who really is suffering from narcissistic personality disorder. And so when you do kind of look at it from that reference point, and then you look at all of these behaviors as this big defensive wall that they don't want anyone to see that black hole and that pain and that vulnerability at their center. They don't want to see it themselves. And I think part of this, and this is just me, like my thoughts, I don't know if this is necessarily true, but the way I see it is if they can build that wall big enough, then maybe they can blind themselves at times to that, just that black hole at their center, right? Like where they're so disconnected from this radiance that gives them self-worth and could give them true confidence and the ability to have empathy and generosity and connect. There's been so many things that have happened that there's such a disconnect that it just feels like this black hole. And so, well, how do you protect yourself? Well, a grandiose sense of self-importance, fantasies of unlimited success, right? Needing excessive admiration. It's how do we build this wall? So that's trying to take a very human and empathetic approach to really more of what's going on in the inside for them, which does not in any way take away from all of the hurt and the damage and the suffering that, you know, people who are displaying these criteria really cause in the life of those around them. I mean, that needs to be validated 100%. So what do you do when you have somebody in your life who consistently does these things, right? Exploits you, has no empathy, expects automatic compliance, right? These things, I mean, I'm smiling because they're so ridiculous, right? When you really have experienced this and look at it from a rational standpoint, you're like, how can anyone treat people this way? But what do you do when someone in your life is truly acting this way towards you? Obviously, it depends on who this person is, right? If it's someone that you're married to, or if it's someone that you're friends with, or if it's your child or your parent, like there's all your boss, your coworker. There's so many different types of relationships that we have that's going to determine what you do in the situation. But across the board, no matter who this person is to you, the first thing that we really want to do is to, I like to say, keep your lid on. And I think I've shown on the show before the 3 layers of the brain, with the top layer of the brain being like your thinking mind, your prefrontal cortex. And when we get emotionally triggered, you can kind of think of that, you know, really intelligent, logical part of your brain going offline, and you kind of flip your lid and you are now being operated by this emotional or your monkey brain, right? And so it's so easy when we are dealing with somebody who treats us poorly, it's so easy to get triggered and to get emotional, to be reactive, and to then, you know, get ourselves all worked up and in a place where we're not being the best version of ourselves. So number one thing is to keep your lid on. Don't allow the person to get you triggered and emotional. And I realize that that is a big ask, right? When someone is, you know, expecting you to be automatically compliant and is acting like they're better than you and demanding things and exploiting you, those are all incredibly triggering things to have happen to us, especially if this is someone in your life who, you know, should be treating you better. So how do we keep our lid on? And, you know, I've done several episodes on this one topic of how do we maintain emotional control. And the short answer is it's a practice, right? It's a lifelong practice of keeping our emotions managed. Regularly doing self-care, regularly doing your breathing exercises, right? Getting to a place of integration with your own system, getting to a place where you're aware of, you know, the messages your body gives you. So for example, if this person walks into the room and your body reacts by maybe you start, you know, your stomach starts to hurt, or you start to feel some tightness in your chest, or your throat starts to feel like it's closing a little bit, right? Your body is telling you that you're starting to feel like you're not safe. And so when you are able to notice those symptoms, maybe even before a conversation happens, you can already start giving yourself, using the tools that you have, such as doing a box breathing, such as finding some expansion, such as maybe just removing yourself from the situation, right? If you're like, wow, my body's really reacting like I'm not safe right now, I'm gonna leave. Doing what you need to do to take care of yourself so that you don't get emotional. Because we know that when someone is displaying these criteria of narcissistic personality disorder, if you get emotional, it's not going to go well, right? And so we say, give them less. So less is more. The more that you say, or the more that you get emotional, the more that this person has to manipulate, to use, to continue to fire you up. So keeping your lid on, keeping yourself more logical, and not allowing yourself to get really emotionally triggered is going to really help you to avoid unnecessary conflict. Because when you are dealing with someone who meets the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, they're okay with conflict. Like, they can use conflict to their benefit. It's really only hurting you, right? And the more that you put yourself out there in an argument, in a conflict, the more they have to manipulate and use against you. And so keeping yourself not emotional, keeping your lid on, being really in tune with your system, not allowing your system to get triggered when you're around them, and then being careful with what you say, right? Less is more. Don't give them things that they can then use to manipulate. A really important tool to use in these situations is boundaries. The more boundaries that you can utilize in a situation like this, the better. And this is really boundaries to protect yourself from a lot of these behaviors, right? We went through all the criteria, and this person in your life has at least 5 of these. So creating boundaries where you aren't allowing this person to have so much access to you, you really have to do this. And so depending on who this person is, the boundaries are going to look differently. But you are protecting yourself. You are protecting the vulnerable parts of you, or the parts of you that this person has exploited in the past. Yeah, so really looking at where this person is overstepping to then decide, how am I going to implement boundaries? If they're typically overstepping in certain ways, really looking at the last 5 times that your boundaries have been broken, and then strategically coming up with ways to avoid those situations with the person. It's really important to understand that it's not your fault. So when you are dealing with someone in your life who shows these behaviors, it's easy to feel responsible or guilty or bad in some way. And a lot of this comes from, this person is probably blaming you for anything that's ever gone wrong. It's part of this, wall that they've put up to protect themselves from ever noticing their deficiencies. So, validating yourself, and hopefully, even just listening to this episode, and maybe you've done other searches online or talked to somebody about this, but knowing okay, if this is a pattern of behavior that this person has in their life, it happened before me, it'll happen after me, this really doesn't have anything to do with me, you can start to really release yourself from any feelings of guilt or any feelings of shame around anything that's happened between the two of you. We talked about this a little bit, but I want to come back to this. But really, self-care, grounding, and fostering your own sense of inner safety, and this your own integration and mental health, right? So when you're on your own, away from this person, can you find a sense of calm? Can you find a sense of safety in your body, in your mind? Can you do a breathing practice or a meditation practice, or maybe just, take a bath every other day have some kind of ritual in your life where you feel like, okay, my system is so completely in the green. I'm taking good care of myself, right? Because we know that having any kind of contact with somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, it's incredibly dysregulating for your system. And so you have to really counterbalance that by really taking good care of yourself. And then finally, if this is somebody, if you're married to them, or if they're in your family, or if it's somebody that you really have to have regular contact with, I really do recommend talking to a counselor, right? Going and finding a therapist. And even if you are just going to get yourself validated, and then to have somebody really strategize with you on boundaries and come up with some strategies for you to regulate your own system, and then figure out how am I going to navigate life if this person has to stay in my life? How am I going to navigate it while keeping my own system regulated most of the time? The goal of being able to stay regulated even if they're in the room. Even if they're in the room and they're, displaying some of these lovely criteria. How do we get to this place of centeredness and integration where we can be okay? So I hope this has been helpful. And it can be, like I said at the beginning, it can be so frustrating when you are dealing with somebody who really isn't taking accountability, who plays the victim, who doesn't show you any empathy. And so, I just want to validate your feelings. They matter. And there is a way to, learn to regulate your own system, and then to create boundaries to where this person doesn't have the power or isn't in a position anymore to really, really cause a lot of suffering in your life, right? This is about reducing the suffering that this person is causing you, because there's no reason for you to suffer as well. And like we said, really at the core of someone who's displaying this criteria is a lot of their own suffering that they're really trying to protect from. So the ultimate goal would be for this person to also go and start working, because, somebody who has the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, if they really truly want to work on themselves, they absolutely can. And just because it's rare, because of the way the criteria builds their defense mechanism to not really see anything wrong with the way they behave, it is rare, but it's not impossible. And so that would also be something that could really help relieve suffering for everyone. So I hope this has been helpful. Drop me a comment. Do you have anyone in your life who, displays some of these criteria? And maybe it's not even 5, but like I said, 1 or 2 can also cause a lot of suffering. Share this episode if there's someone in your life who could use it. I appreciate you watching, and I will be back next week with more content.